Hello, good morning. Welcome everybody. I see people are logging into our Zoom room, so this is great. Welcome to our second US briefing session today. It's the second one since the US election last year. My name is Ella Müller, as you can see in the caption. I'm the head of the democracy program at the Heinrich Böll Foundation office here in Washington, D.C. Our day has just started. That's why I'm welcoming you with a good morning. And it's my pleasure to moderate our briefing today. Since I see people are still in the process of getting into the room and getting started, I would like to start with sharing some housekeeping notes. Um, just a very few. To those of you who are based in German or who would prefer to listen to our conversation today in German, there is a live translation. You can find it if you click at the button button below. It looks like a little globe, and there it will lead you to a translation or interpretation. If you have any trouble finding it, you can reach out to us in the chat, but it is available. It already started, so you can also listen to our conversation in German if you prefer that. As you can also see, we have a Q&A function, a question and answer function. To access it, you can also click the button below. If you have any questions during our conversation, you can just post them in the Q&A section, and we will try to bring them up again at the end of our conversation today. We have reserved a couple of minutes at the end to answer your questions, so feel free to post them in the Q&A chat. And then two last things. My colleague who is based in Berlin, Dietra, is also available in the chat if you have any technical issues or if there's anything that is not working on from a technical point of view. You can also reach out, use the Q&A session function for that as well, and we will try to help you. And last one, but very important, my colleague in Germany just reminded me, we will have a two-question survey at the very end of this conversation today, where we will ask everybody who joined us here, everybody who's listening, just two things about the event, about their experience. And it was very, very helpful to us organizing the upcoming briefing series events. If you would take the time to answer it, it's really just a minute, so it's not will not take a lot of time from you, but I just wanted to remind you or let you know about this at the beginning of our conversation, and will remind you again at the end. There will be a two-question survey. Okay, that being said, I feel like everybody's in the room, everybody's ready, and I'm very excited that Esha Bandera is here with us today. I will say a couple of words about her and introduce you to all of us in a minute, but I just want to say a couple of things about why we are here today and what this US briefing series is all about. It's quite a remarkable day, actually. I'm not even sure if we were aware of the date when we set this up. It's April 29, as you all know, and today marks Donald Trump's 100th day in the office, so we've reached that point. The damage he and his MAGA cabinet have done in just a few months is hard to quantify, actually. If you would start a list of things that happened over the last 3 months, I think it would be an impossible task by now. But what we all know pretty well by now is that we are currently here in the US living through an authoritarian regime change. And I'm probably not going out on a limb when I say that the US, as of now, is no longer a liberal democracy with basic rights and due process. And for the first time in a very long time, the political future of this country seems completely unclear, very open at least. And at a time like this, it is particularly important not to lose our bearings, which is why we have started the US briefing series, in which we try to sort out what is actually happening in America and take deep dives into a specific topic or field. So this is what we are doing and trying to do here today, and trying to achieve, to give us all a little bit of orientation by looking at one specific topic at a time. Today we want to focus on Trump's attack on science and education, and that's great because I'm very excited to have Esha Bandera with me today from the ACLU. So hi, good to see you again. Good morning to New York.
Good morning.
Esha is the Deputy Director of the ACLU's Speech, Privacy and Technology project. To all of you who are not in Washington or not in New York or not based in America, the ACLU stands for American Civil Liberty Union and is an American non-profit civil rights organization. Actually, one of the oldest there is in the US, founded more than 100 years ago. So very impressive from a German or European perspective. And the ACLU is currently at the forefront of the fight against an authoritarian takeover by the Trump regime. The ACLU and Esha's work is definitely one of the reasons why we still have hope in civil society and still have hope when it comes to US liberal democracy. Before Esha joined the ACLU, she was an Equal Justice Works Fellow, and she worked as a lawyer and litigated a number of very important First Amendment cases, always, and that's very impressive, very laser focused on protecting freedom of speech, privacy in our digital age. She also works as an adjunct professor of clinical law at the New York University, where she co-teaches at the Technology Law and Policy Clinic. So in addition to her legal expertise, she also knows the situation at the universities very well, which makes her like the perfect conversation partner today for us. And last but not least, I can highly recommend Esha's latest appearance at the ACLU Know Your Rights podcast, where she talks about digital rights, a topic that seems more relevant than ever. We will put the link in the in the chat so you could follow up after our conversation and hear more from her. Okay, but that's enough. Let's dive right in. Esha, it's great to see you. Hi to New York.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for having me. I just want to make a quick prefatory statement, if I may, which is I am part of a large community of people, lawyers, civil society, ordinary members of the public who are fighting hard every day to preserve the rule of law and democratic rights and freedoms in the United States. And I take a lot of strength and inspiration from that community. So I do want to sound a hopeful note. And one of the benefits of working at an organization like the ACLU, which has been around for 100 years, is that we have been through dark moments before as an organization. There have been past moments where rights and freedoms and democracy seemed at stake. And having that longer view of history is hopefully helpful in this moment.
Yes, I 100% agree. And I think that's why I really wanted to mention how old the ACLU is and what it's already been through. And we sometimes keep forgetting that this country, the US, has this strong history, not only of democracy, but especially of civil society work. And ACLU is such a big part of it. Before we dive into questions, I would like us to take a step back before we talk about like too many specifics. And give our audience a chance to understand what has happened in the last 3 months, because, as I said, it's been a lot. So, can you explain to us what has changed for scientists, for researchers, for students in America since Trump took office?
Sure, and I think my lens, the way I am approaching what has happened in the last 3 months, is viewing a lot of the sort of the cuts or the attacks on scientists, on educators, in a bigger picture project. So I think there's no question that this administration just has different policy priorities, and they've decided to fund different projects. They've decided to cut significant amounts of funding, including foreign assistance funding, including funding for the National Institutes of Health, funding that goes to science, to medicine, to advancing human flourishing. There's just a general view in this administration that the government should be smaller and spending less money. Now, that in and of itself would, of course, have huge impacts on science and education, given what a role the federal government in the United States plays in funding so much of that work, and including, so many of the critical scientific advancements in the United States, which are supported through federal funding. But even if we leave that aside, that there's a new administration which is entitled to have its own policy preferences on how much money to spend on certain projects, the bigger picture trend that is very concerning to me is the use of federal funding and the use of federal authority and investigatory power to silence dissenting viewpoints. And that's where I think we see the broader based attack on freedom of speech and fundamentally a democracy where people can have have different views. And I'll give a few examples, but in many areas, we are seeing not simply that funding is being restricted or cut, but that funding is being conditioned on the recipients not having certain viewpoints or not espousing certain viewpoints. One big area that has been a focus of this administration is so-called DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion. And a lot of funding has been conditioned on people not engaging in DEI initiatives. I can go into further detail about the problems with that, including the fact that it's very vague. And so, it's simply expressing a belief in human equality. Now a condition for losing your funding, what are the lines here? But even beyond the question of how vague it is, federal funding power is not supposed to be used to enforce this kind of ideological conformity. If you are funding, let's say, a cancer research lab, the money is for cancer research, and you can't use that money to then, force the scientists who receive that to parrot particular messages or to avoid speaking certain things that the administration doesn't like. You can't use the power of the purse, in other words, to coerce people into giving up their speech rights. And so we're seeing that in many different areas, whether it's funding for the arts, funding for science, funding for universities, this attempt to use federal funding power to impose conditions on people's speech that have nothing to do with what the program is supposed to be about. And that's, I think, the really troubling aspect of how these cuts have gone about.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very important point and something that we have learned quite the hard way during the second Trump administration. We are used to Republican administrations doing funding cuts, especially in specific areas. We've seen this before when it comes to climate research or similar issues that the Republican Party traditionally didn't care about. But what we are now seeing, as you describe it, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the current administration is weaponizing the funding or like the whole administrative state against some parts of the U.S. society, and
That's
so not
correct.
just taking it back, but also using it to enforce and overreach.
That's correct. It's not just the cuts, and there are cuts, and those have major impacts, but it's that whatever funding remains is now conditioned on ideological conformity. And you mentioned climate. Climate is another big target, and I know that members of civil society who work on climate issues are fearful of the use of state power against them. Um, so it's not just one issue area. It's a whole idea that
Mm-hmm.
federal power can and should be used to reward those who agree with the administration and to punish those who disagree. And
Mm-hmm.
that fundamental viewpoint is what is contrary to the First Amendment, which is a very strong speech protection in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where organizations like the ACLU and many other organizations are fighting back legally,
Mm-hmm.
saying that, again, regardless of the policy choices that you have a legitimate ability to make, you can't weaponize or use funding or other state investigatory or regulatory authority to reward your friends and people who agree with you and punish those who disagree with you. And that's just a
Mm-hmm.
fundamental um, important part of a democracy, right? It's not a situation where even if one party wins an election, that they can then punish the people who disagreed with them, didn't vote for them, continue to disagree with them, and make it more difficult for people to oppose that party in power in the future.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Very worrisome. Um, if I bring us back to US academia and campuses in particular, most of us are not currently spending any time on a US campus, which is unfortunate because it's usually a very lovely environment and a very inspiring environment. But from what you are seeing, what is the state of free speech and the integrity of academic freedom on academic campuses right now? We are at the end of the term, I think. So students are going home now or taking time off for the summer. But over the last 3 months, how is it feeling? How are people feeling on US campuses right now?
There's no doubt that it's a very difficult time for academic freedom. And it seems like a difficult time for students, for scholars, and for the institutions themselves. And there are a variety of reasons for that. But I think in particular, there is, again, clearly an administration priority to attempt to control and have a level of authority over what institutions teach, who they hire, who they admit, and the content of what is discussed there. And I think there's this growing sense in the United States that unless the universities, find solidarity, stand together, that academic freedom is really it's hanging by a thread, it feels. And I think this audience may be most familiar perhaps with Columbia and Columbia having, $400 million in federal funding frozen unless they agreed to certain conditions. Harvard has now sued the administration because it was presented with a list of conditions in exchange for federal funding that it simply could not agree to. And again, I want to make a bigger picture point here also, which is, of course, the federal government always has had the ability to conduct legitimate investigations, whether it's violations of civil rights laws that protect students from harassment on campus, whether it's making sure that federal funding is being spent properly and auditing and so forth. But it can't use the fact that it funds these universities as an entry point into controlling everything they do. And even if an administration finds, the federal government finds that a university has committed a violation, let's say there's been a violation of a civil rights law, the remedies for those are supposed to be proportional and limited, maybe limited to the program that was involved, maybe, it's not supposed to be sort of we found one violation and then we can now put your entire institution under federal control. The law doesn't permit that, and the Constitution wouldn't permit that, consistent with academic freedom. But what we are seeing now is that universities, which, many of them receive hundreds of millions of dollars in federal funding, are feeling this huge pressure that if they don't conform to what the administration wants of them, they're going to lose that money. And when you're talking in the order of hundreds of millions of dollars, that's a huge amount of pressure that institutions face. So I think there's a real reckoning happening for universities in the country, which is, are we going to continue to stand on the bedrock principles of academic freedom that made American universities what they are, which is amongst the best in the world, places where people from around the world have come to engage in cutting edge research, to be able to learn from the best in the world, and to engage in the kinds of debates and discussion and truth seeking that a free and open society allows? Or are these institutions going to instead erode that freedom in the name of further receiving money from a federal government, which, by the way, could change the conditions at any time? So even assuming you could come to an agreement at one point in time that we'll continue to receive this money and engage, have some sort of settlement terms, those could change. So I think universities have to really think very hard, and are in this moment, I think, having to decide what it's going to look like going forward in the United States.
Yeah, I'm glad that we're talking about the reactions of the universities, because I think that has been a question that is on many people's mind. I've already seen it in the chat as well. How are the universities pushing back? What kind of tools do they have? And from your perspective, as somebody who has like a lot of experience with people who would describe themselves as democracy defenders, you yourself are a democracy defender. What can you say about which reactions, which strategies, which forms of resistance are working and which aren't actually? I mean, we don't have the complete picture yet, but we have seen things happening, right? And quite different reactions coming from different universities towards the Trump administration. So what is working What is not working? What options do these universities have?
One thing that I think is working and will hopefully continue to be a strategy is solidarity. And we've seen this in the context of the attacks on law firms as well, by the way, where I think, many of the law firms that have been targeted by the administration for punishment, the sense of being singled out, and that if you don't, agree to the administration's demands, you'll be left alone and everyone else will continue on. I think we've seen the downsides of that strategy. And in fact, the firms that have chosen to fight back against the administration by filing lawsuits against, executive orders targeting them, and have gotten support from other law firms in the profession. I think that is the way forward, right? To say, if you attack one of us on these grounds that are not legitimate, we're all impacted by that. So it's not just you out there being attacked and we leave you to it. There needs to be solidarity across the legal profession to push back. And I think the universities are realizing that as well. And we have seen in the last few weeks, I think, more collective action by the universities, more statements signed by many of them, not all, but many of them. And I think if the universities saw themselves as a collective institution, a key part of a democratic society that has to stand together rather than in competition with each other and feeling like, well, if one of them is attacked, maybe we can keep our heads down and avoid, negative consequences for ourselves. I think that approach is the one that makes it easier for these academic freedom erosions to happen. But I think if the universities were to stand strong together and say, collectively, we won't erode these principles. We won't agree to certain terms that, just are a red line, like for federal oversight of academic teaching, for example. If every university stood together and said that, I think that would be very powerful. And I also think it's very helpful that the first university to file a lawsuit is Harvard, because Harvard is Harvard and it has both a lot of authority, it has a lot of power and resources. And so for an institution like Harvard to be the first to stand up will hopefully give some strength to maybe smaller institutions that don't have the same authority and power and name recognition to, follow along if need be.
I think that's a very good point, and especially not just for people who try to defend democracy in the US, but basically all over the world. Organizing collectively, strategizing together, expressing and showing and living solidarity is actually a pretty powerful tool, even if the administration is as hostile as the current US administration is. So I think that that's a very, very good reminder. And it's actually good for everybody, for our souls, for our spirits, to see that some of these very, very big universities, you mentioned Harvard, but Harvard has, it's not just Harvard, right? It's a couple of universities that are pushing back right now and standing up. You can already see that this has an effect of people, just to see these signs of resistance, of very strong, powerful institutions actually not taking it anymore and pushing back. So I'm really glad that we are seeing this right now. It took a while, I think, but we are there. So that's something. Before we talk further about democracies more general and what a resilient democracy can look like, I wanted to talk about two specific cases that have received a lot of attention, not just in the US, but globally, I think, of two grad students. The cases of Mahout Kali and Rumeysa Öztürk. I hope I'm pronouncing the name not too wrong. So both of them graduate students who were arrested or kidnapped separately in March by immigration officers here in the US. They are currently being detained in an immigration and custom enforcement prison. ICE is the short for that. So a prison in Louisiana, even though they are both legally in the US and have not committed any crimes. This happened. How would you characterize what this is? And maybe also help us understand who is currently particularly affected by Trump's policies?
Those two cases, and there are several other similar cases now, are amongst the most disturbing things that we've seen in the last few months. And I am part of the legal team for both Mahmoud Khalil and Rumeysa Ozturk. We at the ACLU have been, joining with a broad coalition of lawyers to, to try to get them released as soon as possible, because fundamentally what has happened in these cases is that the government has announced a policy of trying to silence viewpoints by using and abusing immigration law to do it. So, the government has said that pro-Palestinian protesters, people who are involved in campus protests, after in the past year and after the war in Gaza started, anyone who sort of was on the pro-Palestinian side is now subject to this policy of the government attempting to detain and deport you from the United States. And again, I think the key point here to understand is this isn't a neutral policy about trying to, find people who committed violations of law during protest, right? I think sometimes we hear people talking about how, well, this is just a policy to go after the people who, committed vandalism or who were violent during protests, who did things that harassed people and constituted legal harassment for which they could be punished. But that's not what the policy is. And if that had been the policy, by the way, they would have then applied it across the board, right? Regardless of the viewpoint of the protesters that was expressed. So, we've seen now what the administration has said is they're essentially going to equate anyone whose viewpoint is who is pro-Palestinian. They are going to equate that with being either pro-Hamas or anti-Semitic by definition, and then use immigration law as their tool of punishing people. And so, we're arguing that the First Amendment just prohibits this because, as you noted, Khalil, Ozturk, there are several others who are in the same situation who are detained. They haven't been accused of any crimes. The government isn't even trying to argue that they violated the law or even that their speech was unprotected. And the government's position is we don't have to prove that because we have the sole discretionary power under the immigration laws to simply detain and remove people. And that's not true, by the way. That's why we have a First Amendment, which says you can't use immigration law as a pretext to shut down dissent. Because again, this is not a program of immigration enforcement. All of these people are here in the country lawfully. The point of announcing this policy is to make people afraid to speak out, that if you're a non-citizen here, your status could be in jeopardy because you expressed a viewpoint that the government didn't like. And you too could end up in a detention facility in Louisiana for weeks or months. And even if, people are ultimately vindicated, even if we can eventually secure the release of Mahmoud Khalil or Rumeysa Ozturk and the others, the message has been received, right? They've already suffered from this policy. And anyone currently who's on a campus, who's a scholar, who's working at a nonprofit, who isn't a citizen, is surely, asking themselves, what can I say? What can I do? How vocal can I be? What will cross the line? And could I also have my whole life upended and end up in a detention facility? So one of the key points about these cases, I think, is you don't have to agree with the viewpoints of the people detained. You can even find their views offensive. You could vocally oppose them. But I would hope that all Americans who care about freedom of speech and due process would recognize that what this government is claiming is a really breathtaking authority, which is that if your speech and viewpoints cross any line that we define, not a line that's defined in law, and not even a line that is easily definable, because they haven't explained, what is sufficiently pro-Palestinian to get you in trouble and what is not, or the administration can define its own line or not define its own line and simply grab anybody off the street who's living lawfully in the country with no notice. And that's a very troubling invocation of power. And by the way, it's not something that would be limited to this issue either. The same authority the government is claiming could be used to go after non-citizens who advocate for climate policies, for people who advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion, as I mentioned, people who advocate for LGBTQ rights. There's nothing about the power that they're claiming that's limited to, the issue of Palestine. And so I think, again, regardless of people's ideological viewpoints on the issue, I would hope most people can unite around the fact that this is not a power that any government should have in a democracy.
Yeah, most definitely. And it's I think also one of the reasons why these two cases, and as you said, there are more, but these two cases in particular of these grad students received so much attention, right? Because suddenly it's not just an academic issue anymore. It's not about what scientists or researchers do on campuses and if we want that or don't want that. It's about who is allowed to live here in the US and has rights. And the Constitution is very clear about that. I mean, rights are for all people, not just for US citizens. But we can feel the effect it does have on people who live in this country with a green card or with a visa, seeing that people can just disappear. The current US government can just make people disappear. And that is very, very worrisome and frightening. And it's great to see that so many organizations are pushing back against it. But it is definitely a completely new area. Like a completely new era we are in right now, where this is actually the case and happening. I want to ask just one last question. What is your sense of how the general public is receiving or perceiving these cases, and how aware are they that this is happening outside of, let's say, the think tank world or the NGO world, where we are very, very much zoomed in?
As you mentioned, I think these cases have gotten worldwide attention, and my sense is that the general public is more aware of these cases than most. And also, I think there are other cases that have really penetrated the public consciousness, like the Alien Enemies Act cases, where you have people who have been removed to El Salvador. And I think one thing that's been really heartening to see is that, again, people across the ideological spectrum, including people who support this administration's policies, are troubled by the due process violations and by the idea that the government would claim it has essentially unreviewable power to pick someone off the streets, whether put them in a detention center in Louisiana, whether remove them to El Salvador, and this idea that it's simply up to the government and they don't have to prove anything against you. They don't have to answer to a judge for those decisions, and that they can't be held accountable for mistakes. And I think that fundamental principle is really resonating with the public, that actually in America, we do have due process. And even if you think that, the administration should be, doing more on immigration enforcement, or even if you disagree with the viewpoints of student protesters, I think and I hope that the message is being received that nonetheless, we have rights, and people who are not accused of wrongdoing, or people who are not given a chance to defend themselves if they are accused of wrongdoing, that is a very troubling road for any country to go down. And of course, it wouldn't be limited to non-citizens. It could happen to anyone. It could happen to citizens. It's not going to be limited in this way, because once you erode due process for any group of people, you've eroded the value of due process and checks on executive power for everybody. And my sense is that the public is hearing that message and relating to that message.
I mean, that's something, at least. At least it's not happening in the dark. We have a lot of people in the room who are non-Americans, who are not based in the US right now. And we have seen a very widespread solidarity with US-based scientists over the last couple of weeks. And many countries, especially in Europe, see this also as an opportunity maybe to attract like world-class research to Europe, because there's a lot of admiration for the research and the teaching that was so much integrated in the US academic system. So a lot of admiration, a lot of respect. And seeing these scientists, these students under attack right now is really shocking for many people who are just watching what's unfolding here in the US from outside. But at the same time, it's not always clear what an international group, what people who are not based in the US right now can actually do to help and support. So from your point of view, what kind of international support would be helpful at this moment? And yeah, let's stay with that for question for now. Any
I think,
advice?
well, I do think maintaining networks, including networks of solidarity with American-based scientists and scholars, is important. I think you're absolutely right that when we talk about a chilling effect of the administration's policies, what we mean is that, people who are studying, working in the United States, maybe who have options to go elsewhere, may not be willing to subject themselves to living under a government where their rights could be disregarded. So again, I mentioned, international students and scholars are already feeling afraid, right? What can we say? What can we do? And those are the people who are living here currently. But people who have a choice, who are thinking in the first instance, should I take this opportunity? If I do, will my research findings be censored? Will I be, abruptly having my research terminated after I've put years of effort into something and I'm very close to the end, but suddenly, that's taken away from me with, again, no process involved? Those are the kinds of decisions that I think people who have options now are making, and those have a long-term effect. And I do think that, as I mentioned, the networks of solidarity are helpful. I think probably what's also helpful is lessons learned from institutions and people in democracies that have gone through rough periods, right? That have gone through periods where institutions or freedom of expression or due process have been under attack, and sharing advice on how those countries got through it, or if they're still in the process of building up democracy, what are the tactics that are working and what aren't. I think oftentimes American institutions have been more isolated, perhaps, from the rest of the world in that sense. And there's a bit of American exceptionalism about, U.S. institutions and the U.S. Constitution, which, has some unique features that other constitutions don't have. But there is a fundamental principle of democracy defense and defending civil society and academic freedom and freedom of expression that is common around the world. And I do think that building those connections with American institutions is really important at this time so that those lessons can be shared.
I think it's a very, very important point, that we keep the dialogue going, transatlantic, trans-Pacific, like in all directions, basically globally, and keep work. We, like people who are based in Europe, for instance, right now, keep in touch with their partners, with like-minded people in the US. We had like a couple of other things that people brought to our attention that might be helpful in this moment. Like, as you said, for many international scholars, the question if they want to travel to the US right now to participate, for instance, in a conference or in like a summit or something, is very severe, and many people don't want to risk that anymore. So finding other places where you can actually host these international scientific gatherings that are so important for academic work is, I think, something where Europe, for instance, could play a bigger role, just like helping out with becoming the host, trying to make these international cooperation still possible. So that's something like on a very practical level that people in Europe or institutions in Europe could do. I would like to add one very specific question from the chat, and I'm only addressing this to you because I know that you have the technology expertise to maybe answer this, because I don't. It comes from Lutz Möller, who has a question about all the databases and data centers that are in the US right now. He's mentioning the climate research that's been done here in the US at NASA, at NOAA, but that is containing knowledge that's been gathered globally for decades now and is also under threat, funding threat, but also sometimes more specific. So how is the future of such a global knowledge commons in US institution discussed in the US? What has been done domestically to safeguard the knowledge that has been gained? And if this is too specific, we can just move on. But I felt like maybe you have an answer there.
I apologize. This is actually outside of my area of expertise, and I'm not sure what the specific plans are. Although I know that there have been efforts for domestic resources to try to preserve those. So, for example, I believe a lot of data sets that American academics and researchers use that people were worried about, being cut off. People made attempts to move those into civil society or academic hands, but I'm not sure of the status of these more international or global data sets.
Yeah. Um, no worries. um, yeah, but it is something that obviously the international scientific community is worrying about. And so we hope somebody has the answers and is working on it. But it is definitely very worrisome if you know how much data has been collected on specific area and is currently stored here. As a historian, I had some conversation with people who work in archives, like actual, like old style, like old-fashioned archives where everything is on paper, but very important and very like crucial for understanding the past. And they are worried as well that all the things that have been collected not only for decades but like for a very very long time and are currently stored, but that is expensive. It does cost money to store archival material, will suddenly be removed or disappear or something because there's no interest in it anymore, or even worse, it's deliberately being destroyed. So I think in many, many institutions, at many spaces and places in the US, people are trying to also find ways to save what has been collected and worked on for a long, long time. So that's not data, that's paper, but it's something that we need as a society. Okay, I have one big question, kind of to end our conversation, and then hand it over to more questions from the audience. And you've touched upon it a little bit already, but I just want to collect your thoughts here. A lot of what has happened in the US over the past 3 months is changing how we think about what it means for democracy to be strong, to be stable, to be resilient. And the US has this very long democratic tradition. It has established processes. It has a strong and very powerful civil society with strong institutions like the ACLU and some others like the universities that have access to these incredible financial and cultural resources. You mentioned Harvard. But still, the system is obviously crumbling. So US democracy is obviously not as resilient as we thought it is. What role does the fact play that we also live through this in a digital age? How does this change our fight for liberal democracies?
It's a very interesting question. And in some ways, I think I'm probably not the right person to answer it because I'm so in the trenches of being part of civil society, engaging in the fight to protect legal rights. And I'd be very interested to know sort of, maybe someone taking a bigger picture view of how we engage, because I think it goes both ways. On the one hand, the fact that we live in a digital age makes it a lot easier to organize. And for example, at the ACLU, we can reach supporters and reach supporters not only domestically but abroad, who can, sort of again engage in messages of solidarity, share insights and advice. And I think the power of being able to communicate so easily is something that we and all of civil society use to our advantage. On the other side, of course, it means that those who, disagree with democratic rights and freedoms or who seek to curtail them also have a powerful tool. So at the end of the day, I'm not sure which way it cuts, and it may just be that it works in both ways, right? Because again, I think the power to communicate has been so important for human rights advocates, for people particularly working in places where there isn't even even the semblance of freedom of speech. So you have to work underground, you have to work through encrypted messages, you have to talk to people outside your country in very secure fashion, and the digital world allows that. Whereas before, if you were let's say you were a dissident in a very repressive country, you might have a very hard time making connections with people outside your country who support you. So that has all been enabled by the digital world. But then, of course, we see the downsides of that too. And so I'm not sure which way it goes, and I wouldn't want to hazard an opinion on that.
Yeah, I appreciate your cautions here and to try to look at it from both sides, because I sometimes feel like we have, I mean, the digital world can feel very dystopian, and especially now in this current under this current administration, where we also see so many of the digital company CEOs very openly supporting the current administration and the attacks on liberal democracy, and are very much on board with that. That is very frightening to see this power, like the money, the politics, everything come together. But as you said, social media, the digital world, has also been a space for democracy organizers for a very long time. And just want to remind us that, I mean, Black Lives Matter, it was a hashtag, right? And that is also what made it so powerful in a specific moment and time. And same with Me Too, or people who organize for trans rights right now. The internet is also can be a place of solidarity and a place where you find like-minded people, even if you are isolated, or if you live in a place where you don't have access to these resources and everything. And I think that's always important to keep that in mind as well, even though it does look very dystopian at the moment, and it is frightening to see what role digital companies are playing right now in this takeover. Um, so we do have more questions in the chat, and I would like to at least pick one of those. We answered a couple of them already, so that's great. But I have one very specific question, because we talked about the Ivy League universities. We talked about Harvard. You mentioned Columbia, but of course, U.S. academic landscape is not just Ivy, even though they get a lot of attention. So what about state universities, which don't have the same economic backup or resources as universities like Harvard, Columbia, or Princeton, or others? How are they dealing with this situation right now and the attack?
You're absolutely right that so much of the focus has been on private institutions, very well resourced Ivy League institutions, and so much of the education that happens in the country is through state universities, and they're such a critical part in many states, the most important part of a higher education system. State universities are in somewhat of a different situation. First, because they are public and they are therefore bound by the constitutional requirements, including to protect freedom of speech, and as protected by the First Amendment. I'm not sure that people outside the United States, or even within the United States, often realize this. When we think about, the First Amendment limits the government from regulating speech, but that includes public or state universities. They are, for all intents and purposes, also not allowed to limit speech in ways that the government could not. And so, I think for them, therefore, a lot of the sort of a lot of the debates and discussions that have happened around what speech should we allow on campus, what content can we permit, that those questions are answered by the First Amendment in a way that for private institutions, I think there's often pressure to restrict, speech of students and scholars that comes externally because they're subject to a different set of rules, and they don't have to abide by the First Amendment. On the other hand, state institutions still receive state funding, and we have seen in the past, this is before this administration. We've seen state governments that have been hostile to funding state universities. And so in an era of austerity, perhaps economic uncertainty, state universities can really feel the brunt of that. And so I think the broader attacks on higher education and the removal of funding, I think, will affect state universities, because where there is this desire to restrict both federal and then state level funding for economic reasons, that has an impact. So I think that when I think of the solidarity of institutions, I do think that it should be across the board, and hopefully is, that you see both private institutions and state institutions, big and small. Some state institutions are very, very large, like the University of California system. You have a variety of state institutions, but that they nonetheless recognize that fundamentally they're in the same boat, seeking to protect their academic freedom, seeking to make the case for public funding, whether state or federal funding, that is, that is not dependent on them teaching or researching or doing certain things or promoting certain ideologies, but that is actually, funding that is to allow them to engage in the pursuit of knowledge, and teach students according to how they think it is best.
Yeah, let's hope the solidarity is there. But also, I mean, sometimes being a state university gives you cover. As you mentioned, the situation in the states can be very different depending on if it's a red state, like a Republican state, or a blue state, a Democratic state. And as you mentioned, we have seen so many of these attacks on higher education already unfolding over the last couple of years in red states. So there's also, like, I feel like, some experience, some knowledge on how to push back. Florida in particular, with all these anti-woke bills and on and on. So there is some experience there, and I hope that we can make use of it on a national level, because it is just so frightening to see all of this unfolding on a national level. And the goal is very obvious. I mean, that's the one good thing about the moment right now. There's a lot of clarity, and it's very out there what is happening. So that's something that we can work with. Okay, we are almost at the end of our session, and I don't want to stretch your time, but I would like to give you the floor one last time, just because, as you know, there are so many people here in this room who are in different contexts and different capacities are worried about the situation of liberal democracies in their contexts and their home countries. And many countries right now at the moment are seeing a rise of the radical right. So from someone who has worked on defending democracy, who has worked in the field of defending democracy for quite some time now and is currently in this community at ACLU, what advice would you give democratic civil society institutions at the moment? What do they need to be prepared, or how can they prepare for a far-right government or for a similar situation as in the US right now?
One thing I have been finding helpful is looking at historical precedent and really brushing up on past moments when it seemed that institutions were failing, and how did they pull themselves out of that? And whether that's specific to the country that you are in, whether that's taking lessons from other countries. As I mentioned before, I think it's so helpful for people to discuss across, globally, what experiences people have had recently, because I think, as you mentioned, this is not unique to the United States. We are seeing attacks to democratic institutions around the world. It's not specific to one administration. It's not specific to one politician. There are threats to freedom of speech, to independent judiciary, to the idea of due process, to inclusion and the rights of migrants everywhere. And so I think that there are common lessons, and those conversations are important to have, rather than thinking that what's happening in any one country is, so unique to that country alone. Of course, there are, very specific contexts that we operate in, but I think that's an important lesson, and taking the lessons from history too. And I think the other thing that, we've been experiencing here is, again, trying to find cross ideological points of commonality is important. So not simply speaking to people who agree with you on everything. And I mentioned this earlier in this conversation as well. I think there has been cross-ideological solidarity on certain fundamental principles, like due process, like the role of judges in acting as a check on the executive branch. Even for people who would vehemently disagree on other politics, even people who support the administration's policies, even people who find, the speech of student protesters to be offensive, and harmful. Being able to have those conversations with people about common values is very important, rather than simply speaking to the small, maybe civil society bubble that we operate in all the time. Because I have been finding, and we have been finding at the ACLU, that there are those cross-ideological points of commonality, and that there's an interest in preserving democratic freedoms and democratic institutions, regardless of people's policy preferences or who they voted for. And I think that's an important lesson to keep in mind, and probably the key way to get out of a crisis of democracy.
Excellent. I think that's something that we can work with. And it also, I'm always so glad if we managed to, even though everything is so worrisome and there's a lot of fear in the room and in the country and all the places where we are going and spending time at the moment, and this, I mean, there's reason for people to be fearful and scared at the moment, but we can't forget or can't let ourselves forget that there's always a reason to fight. There's always a reason for hope, and there's a lot of experience with these fights, even though we sometimes tend to forget about that. So we are not powerless, right? We are. It's not. We're not doomed, even though it does feel like it sometimes. And it's a good fight that we are fighting. So, Asha, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today and helping us navigate what's happening in the US right now, sharing your knowledge, but also your experience and your perspective of all the things that are unfolding here right now with us. We really appreciate it. Before I let everybody go, I just wanted to remind you that there is this 2-question survey, and we would really appreciate it if you could just very, very quickly answer it. You see it probably popping up right now. So it's short questions in German and in English, and your answer really helps us to organize these sessions and series. So thank you so much for taking the time. And Asha, thank you. And I hope we get an opportunity to talk to you again. And we wish you all the best for your work. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us, and just know that there's an international community out there supporting your work and really admiring what you're doing. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Of course. Okay. Bye. Okay.